The heavy scent of pine and expensive vanilla candles filled the air as Zoraida, Zora Woods, stepped into the Kang mansion, her arms laden with gold-wrapped gifts for her first Christmas as a newlywed. She adjusted her coat over her 7-month pregnant belly, a soft smile on her lips as she imagined the family dinner ahead. But the moment the heavy oak doors swung open, the warmth vanished. In the center of the grand marble foyer stood 3 suitcases, Zora's suitcases, packed with such haste that her clothes spilled out like discarded rags. Adulteress! The voice of her mother-in-law, Myung-hee, cracked through the silent house like a whip. Zora froze, the grocery bag slipping from her numb fingers and spilling across the floor. Before she could speak, her father-in-law, Sang-ki, thrust a phone into her face. On the screen was a grainy video from 7 months ago. Zora, unmistakably herself, tangled in the sheets of a hotel bed with a shadowed stranger. I don't know what this is. I have no memory of this. Zora sobbed, her heart dropping so violently she feared for the baby. She looked to her husband, Jung-hoon, for a shred of mercy, but his eyes were voids of cold disgust. "Get out of my house," he spat. Without another word, the family she had tried so hard to please shoved her suitcase into her arms and pushed her out into the biting Christmas snow. The iron gates of the estate slammed shut, leaving a pregnant, heartbroken woman alone in the freezing dark. The snow began to collect in Zora's curls as she sat on her broken suitcase, her body curling inward to shield her belly from the wind. With trembling fingers, she pulled out her phone. Her vision was so blurred by tears that the screen was a smear of light, but she managed to record a short, desperate video, her voice breaking as she pleaded for help. "Please, I have nowhere else to go," she whispered into the camera before hitting send. She didn't realize that in her devastation, she had mistyped the number. The message didn't go to her sister. It traveled across the city to a black marble penthouse where Shin Ji-Woon sat in the shadows. Ji-Woon, the youngest and most lethal mafia boss in the country, watched the video with a deepening frown. He saw the woman shivering in the snow, her pregnant belly a prominent curve against the dark. His jaw tightened as he recognized her face, the face of the gift sent to his suite 7 months ago. The timing was perfect. The woman was vulnerable, and the child she was protecting was his. "Find her," Ji-Woon ordered, his voice like grinding stones, "and bring her home." The wind howled through the skeletal trees of the Kang estate, mocking the festive lights that twinkled heartlessly from the eaves of the mansion. Zoraida sat on the cold pavement, her knees pulled toward her chest as she tried to shield her stomach from the encroaching frost. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. Behind her, the heavy iron gates stood like silent sentinels, marking the boundary of a life that had been snatched away in less than 10 minutes. She looked down at her hands. They were ghostly pale against the dark fabric of her coat, shaking so violently she could barely grip her phone. "Think, Zora, think," she whispered, her voice cracking. But there was no room for thought, only the echoing sting of Jung-hoon's rejection and the mental image of that grainy, impossible video. She had been a faithful wife. She had learned their language, their customs, and their silences, only to be discarded like a piece of broken furniture on the most sacred night of the year. With a sob that tore through her throat, she tapped the camera icon. She needed her sister. She needed someone to tell her that the world hadn't actually ended. As the recording started, the flash illuminated the falling snowflakes, making them look like falling stars. "I don't know where to go," she gasped into the lens, her face wet with tears that froze as they fell. "They kicked me out, Leah. They said the baby isn't his. I'm at the gate, please. It's so cold. I'm so scared for the baby. Please help me." Her fingers were numb, feeling like heavy wooden blocks as she fumbled with the keypad to enter her sister's new international roaming number. Her vision was a distorted smear of salt and light. She tapped in the digits, her brain clouded by the early stages of hypothermia. and hit send. The little loading circle spun, a heartbeat of digital hope, and then delivered. Across the city, in a room that sat above the clouds, a phone vibrated against a mahogany desk. It was a ghost phone, a device that didn't officially exist, reserved for a list of contacts that could be counted on one hand. Shin Ji-Woon didn't move at first. He sat in the darkness, the amber glow of his drink reflecting in his eyes, which were as sharp and unyielding as a predator's. He picked up the device, expecting a security alert or a billionaire's plea. Instead, a video played. He saw a woman, vibrant skin now ashen from the cold, eyes wide with a terror that was visceral even through a screen. He heard her desperate cry for help and saw the unmistakable curve of her pregnancy. Ji-Woon stood up, the ice in his glass clinking softly. He knew that face. He remembered the silk of her skin and the drug-induced haze of her eyes from 7 months ago. He had searched for the gift that had been left in his bed, only to find she had vanished into thin air. Now she had reappeared, shivering in the snow and carrying his legacy. "You sent your cry to the wrong man, Zoraida," he murmured, his thumb brushing over her image on the screen. Or perhaps exactly the right one. Shin Ji-Woon sat in the silence of his top-floor office, the sprawling skyline of the city shimmering through floor-to-ceiling glass like a carpet of cold diamonds. He was a man who lived in the quiet spaces between life and death, a predator who thrived on calculated moves and absolute control. In his hand, the black ghost phone felt heavy, its screen glowing with the frozen image of the woman in the snow. He pressed play again. The sound of the wind whipping through the microphone was a harsh, jagged noise, but it was Zora's voice that anchored him. It was a voice he hadn't heard in 7 months, yet it resonated in the marrow of his bones. He watched her tear-streaked face, the way her skin looked like polished onyx under the streetlights, and the desperate, protective way she cradled her abdomen. His eyes, usually as unreadable as dark water, sharpened. He wasn't looking at her tears, he was looking at the timeline. 7 months. Memories of that rain-slicked night in May surged back, the scent of orchids and expensive gin, the weight of a woman who had been delivered to his suite like a peace offering, her eyes glazed and her body burning with a fever that wasn't her own. He had known the moment he touched her that she had been drugged, a pawn in a game played by men too cowardly to face him directly. He had kept her safe that night, shielding her from the monsters at the door, only to wake up to an empty bed and a lingering scent of vanilla. He looked at the curve of her belly in the video again. A cold, possessive heat began to simmer in his chest. The math was undeniable. The woman who had haunted the periphery of his thoughts was back, and she wasn't alone. She was carrying a Shin, a prince of his bloodline, and she was being treated like refuse by a family of new money aristocrats who weren't fit to breathe the same air. "The Kangs," he whispered, his voice a low, lethal vibration. He knew the estate in the background of the video. He knew the petty cruelty of Kang Sang-ki and the hollow arrogance of the son, Jung-hoon. They had taken his woman, used her to bolster their image, and then thrown her into a blizzard on Christmas Eve. The lion in him didn't just wake, it roared for blood. Ji-Woon set his glass down on the mahogany desk with a definitive click. He stood up, his long, dark coat swaying as he moved toward the door. He didn't need to call a meeting or check his schedule. The Kangs had committed the ultimate sin. They had mistaken his property for theirs.
"Secretary Kim," he said into his earpiece as he stepped into the private elevator, "mobilize the first unit. We're going to the Kang estate, and tell the medical team to have a wing ready at the penthouse. I'm bringing home my wife." The silence of the exclusive neighborhood was shattered not by a siren, but by the low, synchronized hum of high-performance engines. 4 obsidian-black SUVs rounded the corner in a tight formation, their headlights cutting through the swirling snow like the eyes of predatory beasts. They didn't slow down as they approached the Kang estate. They moved with a terrifying military precision that forced the air out of the quiet street. Zora looked up through frozen lashes, her breath hitching in her chest. She was too weak to stand, her body trembling so violently that she had begun to lose feeling in her extremities. The glare of the lead vehicle's high beams washed over her, casting long, dancing shadows against the iron gates that had become her prison walls. The vehicles screeched to a halt, boxing in the entrance. A dozen men in sharp, dark suits stepped out in unison, their presence turning the festive suburban street into a war zone. From the safety of the mansion's balcony, Sang-ki and Jung-hoon stepped forward, their faces twisted in confusion that rapidly shifted towards fear. "What is the meaning of this?" Sang-ki shouted, his voice cracking as he peered down. "This is private property. I'll have you arrested." The rear door of the center SUV opened, and the atmosphere seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Shin Ji-Woon stepped out. He didn't look at the mansion. He didn't acknowledge the shouting men who had just discarded a life as if it were trash. His eyes were locked solely on the small, shivering figure slumped against a suitcase in the snow. His stride was calm and lethal as he bridged the distance. When he reached her, the shadow he cast was immense, shielding her from the wind. Zora looked up, her consciousness flickering like a dying candle. She saw a face of sculpted granite and eyes that promised both a sanctuary and a massacre. Who are you?" she whispered, her head lolling back. Ji-Woon didn't answer with words. He reached down, his large hands surprisingly gentle as they slid beneath her knees and her back. He lifted her effortlessly, cradling her pregnant form against the warmth of his heavy wool coat. The scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloped her, a stark contrast to the smell of ice and betrayal. "Hey, put her down!" Jung-hoon yelled from above, though he made no move to come down the stairs. "That woman is a disgrace to this family." Ji-Woon paused, his profile sharpening in the moonlight. He didn't look up, but his voice carried with the weight of a death sentence. "She was never part of your family," he said, his tone
devoid of emotion. "She is mine, and for what you have done tonight, I will ensure you remember this Christmas as the beginning of your end." Zora felt the world tilt as she fainted against his chest, her last sensation being the steady, powerful heartbeat of the man the world called a monster. Ji-Woon turned his back on the Kangs, carrying his prize into the warmth of the darkened car, leaving the neighborhood in a chilling, expectant silence. The transition from the biting, frozen dark of the street to the suffocating warmth of the penthouse was so jarring that Zora felt as though she were drowning in silk. When her eyes finally fluttered open, she didn't see the familiar, sterile opulence of the Kang mansion. Instead, she was met with a ceiling of dark, polished slate and soft, recessed amber lighting that glowed like embers. She tried to bolt upright, her hand instinctively flying to the heavy swell of her stomach, but a gentle pressure on her shoulder stopped her. "Slowly, madam, your blood pressure is still stabilizing," a calm, feminine voice whispered. Zora blinked, her heart hammering against her ribs. Beside the sprawling, king-sized bed stood a woman in a crisp, charcoal-gray uniform, her expression one of practiced, serene deference. Behind her, 2 other staff members stood like statues, one holding a tray of steaming broth and the other a stack of plush, heated towels. "Where am I?" Zora's voice was a ghost of itself, raw from screaming and the winter air. She scanned the room, noting the high-tech glass panels that displayed the city's vital signs and the silent, heavy doors that looked thick enough to withstand a blast. This wasn't a home, it was a fortress draped in gold. "You are in the residence of Chairman Shin," the woman replied, bowing low. "He has instructed us to attend to your every need. A specialized obstetrician has already examined you while you slept. The young master is safe and healthy." The young master? The term sent a shiver of dread down Zora's spine. She remembered the man in the snow, the shadow who had moved with the terrifying grace of a god. He hadn't just rescued her, he had claimed her. "I need to go. I have to find my sister," Zora stammered, throwing back the heavy duvet. But as her feet touched the heated floor, the sheer scale of the room overwhelmed her. The floor-to-ceiling windows revealed that she was dozens of stories above the world, isolated in a kingdom of glass and steel. The door slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss. The staff instantly dropped their heads, their spines curving in a synchronized show of absolute submission. Zora looked up, her breath catching in her throat. Shin Ji-Woon stood in the doorway, having shed his heavy coat. In a tailored black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, he looked less like a savior and more like the master of the cage she had just woken up in. His eyes swept over her, intense and possessive, lingering on her abdomen before meeting her gaze. "You aren't going anywhere, Zoraida," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "The world outside tried to freeze you to death. Here, you are the only thing that matters. Eat. Rest. Your new life begins today." The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the soft chime of a digital tablet being placed on the bedside table. Zora stared at the screen, her breath hitching as Ji-Woon's hand, large and steady, tapped the play button. "The Kangs showed you a lie," he said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "They showed you a version edited to suit their cruelty. This is the truth." Zora watched as the footage flickered to life. It wasn't the grainy, fragmented mess she had seen at the mansion. This was crystal clear, high definition. She saw herself 7 months ago, entering a luxurious hotel suite, but her heart constricted at the sight. She wasn't laughing or flirting, she was stumbling, her head lolling back as if her neck could no longer support its weight. Her eyes were glazed, staring at nothing. "Look at your hand," Ji-Woon murmured, leaning closer. On the screen, a man whose face was blurred by the shadows of the hallway, Hosen, the Kang's associate, was practically dragging her into the room. He held a glass to her lips, forcing her to swallow the last of a dark liquid before shoving her onto the bed and retreating as a second man entered the frame. Zora's gasp was audible. The second man was the one now standing beside her. In the video, Ji-Woon had paused, his hand hovering over her face, with a look of sudden, sharp realization. He hadn't pounced, he had checked her pulse, his expression hardening as he realized she was unconscious and incapacitated. "I was drugged," Zora whispered, the weight of 1,000 shameful thoughts finally lifting, replaced by a cold, burning rage. "They did this to me." "They used you as a bargaining chip," Ji-Woon said, his eyes darkening. "They sent you to my room to secure a merger they didn't deserve, but they miscalculated. I don't take what isn't freely given." He paused the video at a moment where his face was perfectly clear beside hers. The intimacy of the image was undeniable, but so was the timing. "The night you were cast out by the Kangs, they called that child a bastard," Ji-Woon continued, his hand moving to cover Zora's where it rested on the duvet. "But the blood in your veins is not the only thing that child carries. 7 months ago, Zoraida, you were under my protection, even if you didn't know it. That child is not a Kang. He is a Shin." Zora looked from the screen to the man beside her. The fear was still there, but it was being eclipsed by a strange magnetic pull. The monster the world feared had been the only one to see her as a person that night. "You're the father," she breathed, the reality of it crashing over her like a tidal wave. "I am," he replied, his grip tightening ever so slightly, "and I am the last man the Kangs should have ever crossed." The golden morning light filtered through the reinforced glass of the penthouse, but inside, the atmosphere remained as sharp as a razor's edge. Zora sat at a polished obsidian table, a spread of breakfast she couldn't touch laid out before her. Beside her, Ji-Woon leaned against the console, his eyes fixed on a sleek black device that intercepted every signal crossing into the suite. The phone on the table vibrated, the name Jung-hoon flashing across the screen like a ghost from a life that had ended in the snow. Zora's hand trembled, her instinct to answer born of months of submission, but Ji-Woon's hand moved faster. He didn't pick up the phone, he tapped a command on his console and the call connected to the room's hidden speakers. "Zora? Zora, pick up." Jung-hoon's voice was frantic, stripped of the cold arrogance he had displayed on Christmas Eve. "Look, we need to talk. My father is... he's losing his mind. The stock prices for Kang Group dropped 10% this morning, and there are rumors of a hostile takeover. Whatever friend picked you up last night, tell them to back off." Zora looked at Ji-Woon, but he remained motionless, a predator watching a trapped animal struggle. "Zora, listen to me," Jung-hoon continued, his tone shifting into a wheedling, manipulative softness that once would have broken her heart. "We were harsh, okay? Tempers flared. It was Christmas. But we can settle this. If you sign a non-disclosure agreement and a waiver for any future claims against the estate, my father is willing to give you a generous settlement. You can move back to the States. You'll have enough to take care of that child. Just tell your lawyer or whoever is attacking our company to stop." A bitter laugh escaped Zora's lips before she could stop it. "A settlement, Jung-hoon? You called my baby filth. You pushed me into a blizzard." "We were protecting our legacy," Jung-hoon snapped, his desperation bleeding through. "Don't be difficult, Zora. You have no resources. You're alone. Take the money and go before you make things worse for yourself."
Ji-Woon finally moved. He stepped behind Zora, his large hands resting possessively on her shoulders, his thumbs tracing the line of her collarbone. The warmth of his touch was a silent promise of the power now at her back. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear as he whispered a single instruction. "Tell him the price." Zora looked into the dark, bottomless eyes of the man who had truly seen her that night 7 months ago. She turned back to the phone, her voice steadier than it had ever been in the Kang mansion. "The price for my silence doesn't exist, Jung-hoon," she said, her eyes fixed on the man who was already dismantling her enemies. "And the man I'm with doesn't want your money, he wants your kingdom. And I think I'm going to enjoy watching him take it." She disconnected the call. In the silence that followed, Ji-Woon's grip tightened, not in a way that hurt, but in a way that claimed. "Well said," he murmured. "Now let's watch the rest of them fall." The grand crystal ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and forced smiles, the air thick with the scent of expensive lilies and desperation. Despite the financial tremors rocking their foundations, the Kangs had gathered the city's elite for their annual post-Christmas gala, a frantic attempt to signal strength where there was only rot. Sang-ki stood at the center of a circle of investors, his laughter sounding like dry parchment, while Myung-hee adjusted her diamond necklace, as if it could anchor her to a status that was rapidly slipping away. The double doors at the far end of the ballroom didn't just open, they were commanded aside. The orchestra's strings trailed off into an awkward, discordant silence. Heads turned in a synchronized wave as a presence entered the room that made the glittering chandeliers seem dim. Shin Ji-Woon walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who owned the air everyone else was breathing. He was dressed in a charcoal suit so sharp it looked lethal, but it was the woman on his arm who stole the breath from the room. Zora looked ethereal, draped in a gown of midnight velvet that elegantly hugged her pregnant silhouette. Her head was held high, her gaze no longer flickering with the desire for approval, but burning with a quiet, regal fire. She looked like a queen returning to a kingdom she had already conquered.
"What is the meaning of this?" Sang-ki stepped forward, his face turning a mottled purple. You have the audacity to bring that woman here." Young-hoon moved toward them, his eyes wide with a mixture of lust and fury, but he stopped dead as two of Ji-Woon's men stepped into his path like shadows made flesh. Ji-Woon didn't raise his voice, yet it carried to every corner of the silent hall. "I thought it only fitting that Zora be here to witness the final act," he said, his eyes locking onto Sang-Ki's with terrifying intensity. "The Kang Group has spent decades building a name on arrogance and cruelty. Tonight, that name is worth exactly nothing." A ripple of panicked whispers erupted as guests began checking their phones. The screens glowed with breaking news alerts. Kang Group assets seized. Major creditors call in loans. Shin Syndicate completes hostile takeover. "You can't do this!" Myung-hee shrieked, her hand flying to her throat. "We are the Kangs!" "You were the Kangs," Ji-Woon corrected, his voice as cold as the snow he had rescued Zora from. "As of 5 minutes ago, your holdings are being liquidated to pay the debts you owe to the woman you threw into the street. You are bankrupt, socially, morally, and financially." Zora felt the weight of the ballroom's gaze, but for the first time, she didn't shrink. She looked at Jung-hoon, seeing only a small, hollow man where her husband once stood. Ji-Woon leaned in, his hand warm and steady on the small of her back. "Don't look down, Zoraida. The view is much better from the throne." Turning his back on the ruins of the Kang dynasty, Ji-Woon led her out of the room, leaving the elite to feast on the remains of a family that had finally been erased. The air inside the abandoned dockside warehouse was thick with the smell of stagnant saltwater and rusted iron, a sharp contrast to the sterile luxury of Ji-Woon's penthouse. At the center of the cavernous space, bathed in the harsh, flickering glow of a single industrial lamp, a man sat bound to a steel chair. It was Hosen, the Kang's longtime fixer, his face a map of bruises and sweat. Ji-Woon stood in the shadows just beyond the light, his silhouette imposing and motionless. He didn't need to use his hands, his presence alone was a suffocating weight. Zora stood a few paces behind him, her hands wrapped tightly around her coat. She had insisted on coming, needing to see the face of the man who had stolen her memory and her dignity 7 months ago. "The Kangs paid you to drug her," Ji-Woon's voice drifted through the darkness, low and terrifyingly calm. "But a man like you doesn't take such a risk for a simple family squabble. Who gave you the sedative, Hosen? And who ensured she was delivered to my door specifically?" Hosen coughed, a wet, ragged sound. He looked past Ji-Woon, his eyes landing on Zora with a flicker of pathetic desperation. "It wasn't just the Kangs, I swear. Sang-ki wanted the merger, yes, but he didn't have the connections to get into your private wing, Chairman. He didn't know the codes." Ji-Woon stepped into the light, the movement so sudden Hosen flinched. "Then who?" Hosen swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a trembling whisper. "It was the sister, Leah." Zora felt the ground tilt beneath her. The name hit her harder than the winter wind at the Kang estate. "Leah? No, she's my sister. She was the one who told me to go to that gala. She said she'd look out for me." "She was the one who handed me the vial," Hosen confessed, the words pouring out in a rush to avoid the silent wrath of the man in front of him. "She was deep in debt, gambling, bad investments. The Kangs promised to wipe her slate clean if she helped them frame you for adultery later. But she went further. She sold the access codes to your suite to a rival syndicate. She didn't care what happened to you, Zora. She just wanted the payout." The betrayal was a physical blow. Zora stepped back, her breath hitching as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into a sickening new reality. Her own blood had sold her like a piece of meat, orchestrating her ruin before she had even conceived the child she now carried. Ji-Woon turned to her, his expression softening only for a fraction of a second before his gaze returned to the prisoner. "Your sister is no longer your concern, Zoraida," he said, his voice a promise of impending storm. "She made a choice. Now she will learn that the blood she betrayed has found a much more dangerous protector." He signaled to his men in the shadows. As they stepped forward to deal with Husin, Ji-Woon reached for Zora's hand, his grip a solid anchor in the middle of her collapsing world. The Kangs were just the beginning. We're going to find her. The penthouse balcony was a suspended island of glass and steel, hovering high above the city's winter haze. Zora stood at the railing, a thick cashmere shawl draped over her shoulders, watching as the first flakes of a fresh storm began to dance through the air. Below her, the world looked like a sprawling, intricate toy set, but for the first time, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel like the unwanted guest at a table that would never have a place for her. Inside the suite, the rhythmic tapping of a keyboard and the low, urgent murmur of voices signaled the execution of the final phase. Ji-Woon stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghost-like against the glass. He was on the phone, his commands brief and absolute. As Zora watched, a notification pinged on the tablet resting on the outdoor table. It was a live feed of the Kang Group headquarters. She watched as heavy moving trucks pulled up to the curb and men in dark suits began removing the art, the furniture, and the very logo that had once defined her oppression. The seizure had begun. The Kangs were no longer a dynasty, they were a debt to be collected. Ji-Woon stepped out onto the balcony, the cold air barely seeming to touch him. He stood behind her, his presence a warm, immovable wall. He didn't say a word, but his hand came to rest gently atop hers on the railing. The heavy weight of his signet ring pressed against her skin, a silent reminder of the power now shielding her. "It's over, isn't it?" Zora whispered, her breath blooming in a white cloud.
"The Kang's era is over," Ji-Woon corrected, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the city's lights met the gray sky. "But yours is just beginning. Every asset they owned, every brick of that estate they threw you out of, has been transferred to a trust for the child. They spent their lives building a kingdom only to hand the keys to the woman they called a stranger." Zora looked down at her belly, feeling the soft, rhythmic kick of the life inside her. 7 months ago, she had been a pawn in a game of greed. On Christmas Eve, she had been a victim of a cold-blooded betrayal. But today, standing in the fortress of a man the world feared, she felt a different kind of strength taking root. The sorrow that had nearly frozen her heart in the snow was being replaced by a calm, sharp-edged resolve. The snow began to fall harder, masking the city in a veil of white, but Zora didn't shiver. She leaned back into Ji-Woon's strength, her gaze steady. She was no longer a discarded bride or a wandering soul. She was the mother of the Shin heir, protected by the most dangerous man in the city, and the reign of the Kangs was nothing but a memory dissolving in the cold.